Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Sync the Chaos podcast, where we try to bring some synergy to the plethora of information out there over the internet. I have my friends Hari and Suhas joining me today, and we are going to have a laid back yet informative discussion on the topic biology. We will be covering a vast array of topics in biology, such as genetic engineering, stem cells, biomimicry, healthcare, nervous systems, and sleep. That being said, as usual, let me give a disclaimer that we are no experts on these topics that we are discussing. And we are here just to compile some interesting information that is available over the internet. And we thought we can add some of our own thoughts to it so that we come up with a productive time discussing these topics. And the hope here is that these discussions will spark some sort of interest in our listeners, and you can go further and dig up few more interesting facts on these topics. So before we get started and talk in detail about today's topic, let me start off by asking you a bit personal question as to your exposure on the topic subject of biology. Is it a topic that you have been fascinated with? Is it something you are interested as a kid, or when was the last time you studied biology?
Yeah, so I guess the last time we all would have studied biology was in school before we chose engineering as our group to pursue, right? Um, I feel like after that, like basically spending about 4 to 5 years of reading, engineering or like mechanical engineering or any of your specific engineering subjects in detail. Uh, Hearing and listening about some biological topics definitely makes you more fascinated because it's something that you haven't read for a while. So that is how my interest in this topic stemmed from.
Mhm.
So I would say, like just like a laid back YouTuber, whenever I have free times, I do see myself particularly being interested like in topics related to biology that YouTube recommends me. Uh,
Mhm.
there's a channel called It's Okay to Be Smart that I like to watch, where he covers an array of like biological topics to discuss. Can be anything with evolution, pandemic, anatomy, and understanding a lot of fundamental biological topics. Um, I've
Okay.
also I've also like sort of followed a lot of anatomy videos which fascinate me on the functioning of various organs in our body, and it just blows my mind how evolution has come so far and we've developed into such sophisticated like machines in which like our organs are uh, programmed to do things in a very specific manner and maintain and sustain our lives in this equilibrium. So that's how I've gotten interested in an array of like topics in biology, and was really interested to talk about that and have a discussion in this setting.
Mhm.
So yeah, very similar to Hari. I think the last time we studied biology was probably when I was in 10th grade, and then I had one more class in engineering. Personally, I never liked biology due to the large array of terminologies, which was like
No,
confusing. And
don't worry, you won't be judged. I am in the same boat. When
yeah,
Hari suggested this topic, I was a bit not motivated, but yeah, go ahead. I'll
yeah,
add to this.
and there is
Yeah.
also this aspect of like if you need to study biology, then you need to deal with uh, you know say what an organism, or if you have to study more about human anatomy, then you need to understand like what the organs look like. And if you have to do something like in real life, if you have to perform a surgery or something, like you should not have any fear. So that's something that I struggled with. So I never chose biology as a field of study. It was not my priority. But after doing engineering and doing masters, there is a lot of scope for using engineering tools and techniques in order to control and make biological systems operate better. Or in other way, you can look at it from the other aspect, like you can use those biological systems and probably you can create engineering systems that operate much more efficiently. Yeah, that's something that motivated me to take up this topic as well. So there is a lot of things that we don't understand with biology, and with advancements in technology, I guess we can understand it better and use engineering concepts to control and, yeah, essentially make use of it. So recently I came across an interesting little fact. Did you guys know that the whale, the blue whale, during a deep sea dive, its heart rate reduces to just 2 beats per minute? Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
Yeah. So, and even hibernating animals have like 1 to 2 beats per minute. So it's really crazy how evolution has engineered these kind of complex biological systems that can operate so efficiently. So that's my take on biology.
That's
What do you
fascinating. I
guys-
mean, both the speakers today, apart from me, seem to be pretty motivated about the topic. So before we get further into the details, I just wanted to share with our listeners how we ended up choosing this topic. It's pretty ironic that all three of us here are mechanical engineers and we came up with a topic on biology. But we started off with an idea about discussing the advancements in the 21st century, and then we jotted down few of the key fields that we need to stress upon, and that way we ended up identifying few core fields in which biology was one, and we decided it's going to be an exhaustive list of achievements that our human race has done in these years. And we thought, why not just split them into individual podcasts and discuss them, these topics in detail. So that's how we ended up with our first topic, biology. And I think it's sort of more relevant in the current times, right? With the current pandemic, the couple of years have been devastating for us, and terms which were unfamiliar to our generation have become a household terms right now, right?
Yeah.
Like herd immunity, spike proteins, all these terms were something which we didn't
Epidemic.
even care about. But last couple of years, I think most of us have been educated and been aware of such terms, and I think everyone is becoming their own specialists on COVID-19. So we thought we'll start off this particular discussion by discussing the pandemic.
Yeah, so pandemic has been around for like now 2 years now, is it? So
Yep, it was 2020 Jan, right?
yeah, so that it's been around for quite a while, and by now a lot of us are used to it. There's fatigue that we see in the society. A lot of people have suffered because of this uh, viral infection. But it's interesting to know that there were a lot of epidemics that cropped up previously in human history. For instance, the Black Death, which was caused due to bubonic plague, took nearly 200 million lives, and it eliminated nearly 1/3 of the European population. So that was kind of a virus that was transmitted from rats to human beings. And these viral this virus essentially caused inflammation in the lymph node, and yeah, it resulted in bleeding and death. And a lot of people did not really understand, back in those days when people didn't have, there were no medical advancements. You can imagine how hard things were.
So, like, I was about to ask you this question, like, when did this happen?
This was in the year between the year 1346 to 1353.
I think at that particular time, I can hardly believe that they would have known what's going wrong. They would have looked up at the stars and just prayed for God to save them. because even in the 21st century, initially when COVID broke out, doctors weren't in a right frame of what you call in a position to cure that. It was all like the cure was based on previous knowledge, but no one was sure what's going to happen. So we can imagine what it would have looked like in the
Yeah.
13th century, right?
Yeah, and there was not a well-established study on medicine. Like there was not a well-established. So you had like all these philosophers and people who just practiced medicine based on trial and error. They just they said, okay, let's give him the patient this medicine. Let's see if it works, and if it does not work, try something else. Try natural herbs. And yeah, I can only imagine, like, the virus, the plague lasted for so long. And then something that happened in the 19th century was the Spanish flu. This lasted from 1918 to 1920, and the death toll was like equally quite high. It was like close to 100 million people. And yeah, this spread worldwide.
Yeah, if we remember, it's the H1N1 flu, right?
Yeah, the influenza H1N1 flu. So
yeah, it infected about more than 500 million people worldwide. Which is a big number, right?
right. And back then technology was not around. So today, if you look at like how we have handled COVID, due to internet and mass media, we are able to communicate information almost instantaneously, and like the entire society is able to go into a shutdown mode. But back then, like, people didn't know. And how do you self isolate or isolate other people who are infected? Yeah, those are like some really serious challenges back then.
A lot of the symptoms for Spanish flu have very common symptoms with COVID: dry cough, sore throat, headache.
Yeah, so coming back to the pandemic, like, do you guys have any kind of a crazy story? Like, how did it affect your lives on a more personal level?
For us as students, I think there was a new term coined by the department called Zoom fatigue, which was kind of interesting to hear, because all the classes were happening on Zoom. Students were sort of like completely vexed or sort of uninterested in attending lectures on Zoom, and we coined a term called Zoom fatigue. So all the students were like looking forward when the classes would start in person. Obviously, there are few advantages of classes becoming online, but after a point, you feel like you're missing that human connect, right? Also, it wasn't like all the classes were easily, it was easily possible to convert all the classes into an online mode, because you tend to have classes which require lab sessions, and then it was a hassle to like coordinate the whole class, make sure you are socially distant, and you don't spread the virus further without disrupting your education. So as a student, I think those were the things that we were mainly facing during the pandemic.
Right. Yeah.
You want
To
to
add
add
to it,
something, Hari?
yeah, I would say online grocery shopping was something I never considered before pandemic. If I wanted to buy something, we usually plan ahead and go to Walmart or any of the grocery stores weekly, and physically go pick your items and then buy them, right? But
Yeah,
I
well
feel like
said.
the pandemic has sort of opened up the option to get your groceries online. For some, uh, personally for me, I felt that it was saving me a lot of time especially if your weekends are packed and you have a lot of things going on. Sometimes just going out to buy groceries can take you like 2-3 hours off of your weekend, which you could probably use for finishing up other activities. So getting food online, getting groceries online, um,
Yeah.
I just saw a sudden sort of boom in utilizing that feature, which I felt like before the pandemic was not very prevalent. People were not considering it much, and also like big companies were not sort of investing in that feature, since people always felt that they were comfortable going to the shop and buying it personally. But the pandemic has definitely increased the efficiency and made the process of delivering food, delivering commodity at your doorstep more efficient.
Mhm. Yeah, when you brought up this topic of online ordering stuff, I was monitoring the stock price of Amazon. So apparently, the stock price of Amazon increased a lot after the pandemic started. Like when the lockdown came into picture, the Amazon stock price shooted up from, let me see the numbers, around $2,100 in February of 2020 to $3,200 in October 2020, which I'm guessing it's because of the pandemic and users increasingly using these services, I guess.
Mhm.
Right. So as the pandemic, we see that there are different mutations that are coming about. And right now we have the Omicron. I was just looking up at an article which was, predicting like what is going to happen in the future. Like, are there going to be new mutations? Are we likely going to see any new different variants? So what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, every other day I hear some news about a new variant. At this point, I'm losing track of the names. Not that I can remember them, but I recently heard that there is another new variant that has been found in China, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, okay.
But I think these variants, obviously, it's inevitable. It will start, the new variants will continue creeping up, I feel. But it all depends on how transmissible and how lethal they end up being, right? It's like
Right,
survival of the fittest.
right,
And what I have heard is uh, the current Omicron one, it has high spread, like spreadability, but the lethality is very less, which is good because after a point it might end up becoming like a common flu for us, which I hope it soon does, so that we can come back to normalcy.
right. It almost reminds me of an optimization problem. Like, how does the virus mutate enough so that the fitness landscape or the fitness value for the variant increases or it decreases? So you can assume it to be a 3D contour plot, the fitness landscape. And so the peaks are like the most efficient uh, survival strategy for a virus, and like we are the host, and so with time we are going to develop antibodies or a vaccine or like uh, strategy to prevent it, but how it
Mhm.
can mutate uh, in such a way that, so if you consider the 3D contour to be set of peaks, so how does it jump from one peak to another peak? So once we have a resistance towards one particular variant which is like dominant, before it becomes dominant in, say, before it becomes another variant and becomes dominant in different kind of traits, like say if it is able to be even more transmissible, uh, how quickly can it do that before we human beings recognize it and develop vaccines for it? So yeah, that's the challenge that the doctors are facing right now. And yeah, the different mutations have different impacts, and that depends on the fitness landscape.
So I think when we talk about pandemic, one thing which we can't avoid talking about is how do we tackle them, which I think as humans, the most effective weapon that we have, at least to my knowledge, is vaccination, right?
Mhm.
And if we have to give it a positive spin about the whole pandemic issue, one of the achievements that we as humans have achieved is to roll out the vaccination in the quickest possible time in the history of vaccines being produced. I think this was the quickest that humans have been able to
Right.
create an effective vaccine against the virus. So maybe we can spend some time discussing about how vaccines are being generated. Specifically, let's maybe delve into the topic of genetic engineering.
So genetic engineering, I would say it all comes under a broad umbrella of synthetic medicine, right? So anything that we are synthetically sort of developing to address a pandemic or a disease. Although the mRNA vaccines that we are using for COVID is not anything that is genetically, that it doesn't affect your gene, right? But it is a synthetically produced protein, right? So it basically trigger the same reactions in your immune system that helps your immune system sort of identify the spike protein uh, when it actually has an infection from COVID, right?
But it has
So
more of like a placebo effect, is it?
right, so it's sort of like a memory. We'll get into that in more detail. So it's almost like, like your DNA in your cells, in your immune system, store the information of an attack that has previously happened. We'll get into that in more detail with the invention of something called CRISPR. We'll get into that in more detail, like in the later sections of genetic engineering, as it played a very important role for it and for stem cells. But that is the whole idea, right? As it gave genetic engineering gives us the ability to synthetically make modifications to the very building block of human beings, that contains all the information needed to sustain life and pass down all the traits through different generations. So to give a brief history, we don't know. We've been sort of selectively breeding. By we, I mean like civilization as a whole. By not fully understanding the DNA, we've still been sort of selectively breeding some plants, some animals. For example, if you take dogs right now, right, we have so many breeds of dogs. They were all like selectively breeded for certain traits, for like thick fur or some aesthetic attribute that we wanted to amplify. So even without knowing what DNAs are, we've been sort of selectively breeding. And also, if you sort of expose any organism or cell to radiation itself can chemically alter the DNA content in a living organism, and that can sort of accidentally lead to evolution, and having some traits being suppressed and some traits being passed over.
Yeah.
But
This point that
formally,
you brought up, this point that you brought up, Hari, reminds me of a few of the superheroes movies, right? Like they're
yeah,
exposed to radiation and that
yeah, when
makes
they
them
show you like that, yep,
genetically mutated with superpowers, right?
yep. To be honest, there are I've in when I was sort of doing my research for the podcast, it was surprising to know that in earlier days, when the field of genetic engineering and modification was new, a lot of doctors, when they didn't actually know how to sequence a genome, that was like
Mhm.
done only later in 1900s, and that process itself was funded by like NSF, and it was like it was a couple of years project to basically decode the human genome, so people couldn't wait to that long. So the shortcut to doing genetic engineering in sort of an uncontrolled manner was just to expose it to radiation. So they would just take like bacterial cells, plant cells or animal cells, and then just expose it to radiation and see, okay, by chance, let's see what kind of modification happens. But it was only in 1958 that we like formally sort of coined the term DNA.
Uh-huh.
The inventor in the lab, his name was Arthur Kornberg, and it was interesting because his initial paper that he submitted on the discovery or coining the term deoxyribonucleic acid for DNA, they
Mhm.
actually rejected it because it did not have enough evidence, and they were like the review panel was suggesting a different name instead of DNA. like polydeoxyribonucleic acid or something. And so he had to sort of publish it again to sort of get it approved. So that is like literally the first time we sort of understood this content, these genes and DNA that are contained in cells, and these are the basic building blocks in organisms.
You mentioned 1950, right?
Yeah, 1958 when this was like formally
Not,
published and
yeah, not too long ago then.
right. After that, we've been, after we've understood DNA, it was only 1971 when something called recombinant DNA, which means, okay, now you know what DNA is, but recombinant DNA means we actually developed the method, or we understood that we have the capability of cutting and splicing them. So we can basically mess with these DNA and this information. It's not just like a read-only thing, but you can actually modify them. So that discovery was sort of made in 1971.
Like, so when you say splicing and cutting it, so my question is like, so what are this DNA made of? Like, is it just proteins?
Yes, basically proteins. I might be wrong here, but although it's basically a chemical structure, and it's made of three. I think it's a phosphate, it's a protein, and the third one I forget. So it is in that form that information is stored in. And from the discovery of recombinant DNA, right, rDNA, the process is called. From that stage onwards, there was literally a boom because people just understood that, okay, we know this thing called DNA and we can actually change them, like mess with them. So then people just, have been doing research since then, and then we've been getting genetically modified plants. We've been modifying DNA to produce a lot of vaccines, actually. For example, if you take insulin, right? This was something interesting I came across. So insulin for a long time was used. Obviously, you need insulin to treat diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes. Of the two, type 1 and type 2, type 1 is the most serious. So it's when basically your own immune system is going against your pancreas that release the hormones to balance blood sugar level. So your immune system itself is sort of damaging or not letting the pancreas do its work. So you need an external injection of the hormone, insulin, uh, and make sure your immune system doesn't attack or suppress it. So for a long time, what we were doing was before we knew we could genetically synthesize them, we were depending on natural sources. Like we were looking at pig pancreas, like human pancreas. We would basically take them and see how we could use them to produce insulin in a lab. And so to produce about 1 pound of like insulin, I'm talking back in like 1980s, you required like about 8,000 pounds of pancreatic glands from 23,500 animals. So this is before they knew how they could synthetically produce insulin. So once recombinant DNA technique was developed, they were able to make a big breakthrough that they can modify bacterial or yeast DNA to make synthetic insulin. And that is what is being used till now in order to treat type 1 diabetes. It is way more economical, way more ethical. So you can culture bacteria in like lab. It doesn't matter how big of a number, and then they multiply pretty rapidly, and you get a steady supply of insulin. In terms of like food, it was in 1988 when US introduced something called BT corn. As you know, here corn is like one of the staple crops that is being grown. Here, the major problem that farmers were having is that it would be infested by a very specific pest, and that would affect their yield, crop yield. So using genetic engineering in 1988, they were able to sort of amplify a specific gene that helped like the crops or the plant cells to identify and fight against this pest and be resistant to any sort of attack.
Yeah, when you bring
Yeah.
this up, I also remembered the use of genetics where they modify the plant so that you get, for example, a particular fruit throughout the year, right? Usually some fruits are
Yes.
seasonal, but nowadays, if you go to the market, you can find them throughout the year. I think one of the implications of advancements in genetic engineering is that we can eat our favorite fruits throughout the year, I guess.
Yeah. I did not have any specific example I came across that
Mhm.
directly was connected to, making fruits and vegetables seasonally independent. But we can see very well why you couldn't do that, because obviously genes are like the basis of a plant's attribute on how much water it needs or temperature it can withstand. So if you are able to understand that level of detail, you can very well modify it to make it perennial. We used it aesthetically also. There's something called like zebra fish, and I just looked up. You can get them for like $10, but those are those fishes are like fluorescent. They almost look transparent and they glow. The
Wow.
thing is that basically, I think they were. Oh, I might be wrong from the derivative of the gene. I think they took the gene from another species of like some sort of like jellyfish that is like transparent, and sort of gave its attributes to this fish. So it was just more aesthetically developed for that.
Genes can also be used to make like identical clones, right? Like, so
Yeah.
you know that bacteria creates like when it divides, it creates replicate copies.
Hmm.
And if you are able to insert this gene in a bacteria and then it replicates, then you have like a cloned gene. But I'm
Hmm.
not sure if it's legal because it's kind of an ethical issue.
Right.
And like some countries have
Well,
banned cloning, human cloning.
I don't know if they have really been successful in cloning humans, but I do remember this tidbit from high school where we used to we had this thing called the first cloned animal was Dolly the sheep. Do
Dolly.
you guys
Yeah.
remember that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I was almost coming to that. That happened around 1996. They had clearance to do it with animals. I was actually also curious to see if they cloned human beings, but if I remember from what I had researched, it seemed like it was a very highly controversial, like ethical issue. So
Mhm.
the scientists or the geneticists, like who were doing those research, were only allowed to do in like the genetically modify the embryo and do their study for a couple of months, and then were forced to destroy it. So they didn't like let it develop into a fully grown baby or human being.
Because when I Google it, I see that on December 27, 2002, they have announced the birth of the first human clone called Eve.
Oh, I see. Okay. When was that
Yeah,
again?
but in 2002. So
Oh,
I'm
okay.
not sure what happened after that, but it's interesting. Maybe we should look it up after this podcast, I guess.
Right. Does it say anything about how long did it live or anything like that? Because usually the problem with
Yeah.
genetically modified organisms is expectancy.
Mhm.
There was this Chinese researcher
Mhm.
who created like genetically. He actually, he created the first gene edited babies, but
Mhm.
then was later silenced because after facing criticisms from uh, China and abroad, because he was trying to tinker with what uh, the building blocks of nature life by using
Mhm.
an untested gene editing tool. So it does raise a serious ethical issue, like what
Right.
if this kind of a technique or a tool leads to health issues later on in the life of, say, the baby. So who is
Yep.
responsible for it?
Yeah, I was looking up upon what happened to this particular news, but based on the brief searches that I did, I think A year later, they have denied any reports of such a cloning happening. So I'm not sure whether it's factual information or it's some sort of conspiracy. But yeah, I think we have to further look into it. Something interesting to look into, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we'll discuss designer babies later. It's basically the idea is that I think Suhas and I were like discussing that offline, but it's basically the idea that, let's say you have a family and disease is running through the family, like everyone is very susceptible to cancer, diabetes, or something. You use genetic engineering to suppress a specific gene that is responsible for carrying down that hereditary disease or being prone to that was specific virus or disease. Uh, and the idea is you could use this to sort of selectively promote attributes to the next generation. Like if you want people, specific people to be like, if you want your like progenies or your children like to be like specifically smart, I don't know, like muscular, like strong, like you can go to a doctor and tell them like you want these attributes and they'll do it. Now you can see how this can be so ethically controversial, but this is like I'm talking about if this becomes possible. I'm talking about something in in a few decade generations. But that is the whole basis of it, is that you choose some attributes and suppress or promote the genes that are responsible for that. This brings us to an interesting point in basically in genetic engineering, is that in 2006, a group of scientists, I think there were two people actually, they discussed a principle called CRISPR, CRISPR. So I think it stands for clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. It's a mouthful, but this was I would say the biggest breakthrough in terms of genetic engineering and also stem cells as we look at it later. They were actually awarded two Nobel Prizes, one in 2012 and even in 2020. One of the two scientists, Jennifer Doudna, was awarded Nobel Prize for their contributions to CRISPR. So basically, what the idea is, if you remember our previous discussion, we were talking about this memory of like an attack, right? If some infection attacks you, sort of have a genetic memory that remembers how it fought that infection. So it will be helpful uh, in future if it happens again. So it was the same idea that these scientists sort of observed in bacteria. What they say is that in evolution, the eternal battle has always been between virus and bacteria. Like both sort of fight their own like place in evolution or in the environment. So what they observed was that when a specific bacteria in like they were testing in some marsh land, uh, when this specific bacteria was affected or infected by a virus, a lot of them died, right? But the ones that survived, the bacteria that survived, it sort of cut a portion of the virus's gene and it stored it within itself. And so when it was attacked by that same virus again, right, it was able to use this cut piece of DNA to recognize what is being attacked and sort of annihilate the virus or sort of make it nullify the virus. So they were like, they basically took this concept and just expanded this to us, like as a disease or as human beings when we get sort of attacked by a virus or any foreign particle. What we do is we sort of store a fragment of the DNA of like the attack of the virus that is attacking us, and then we use that to sort of develop our own immune system to be capable of fighting that virus.
So that's how the immune system works. by by training it to recognize the
Right.
incoming virus, right?
Right. It understands that incoming virus in the fundamental level, in its own like DNA or RNA level. Yeah. So basically, the idea of CRISPR was that. So it would take pieces of the DNA, right, from the invading virus to just snip it off, and it would store it in like a genetic archive that would be present in the surviving bacteria. So they basically said, okay, why not we do the same with our DNA, right? We we use this technology, CRISPR. The advantage is it's very precise, uh, and how it basically works is that it consists of a guiding RNA. It is basically a device that helps you go to like a DNA strand and identify which the target DNA or which target segment you want to modify. So for that, they use the RNA, right? And then it goes to that spot and it excretes an enzyme called CAS. And then when the guide RNA matches up with the target DNA, the Cas, this enzyme, just cuts that DNA, and the new segment of the DNA can now be added. So in terms of that bacteria, it was just cutting it and storing it, right? So what these Nobel Prize winners, what these scientists did is they were like, why not cut it? And once you cut, you'll have two loose strands, right? Why not cut and then we add what we want to add? Like we add our own modification. So they basically added that one extra step, and that was like a game changer in terms of genetic engineering. Right
Yeah,
now,
I
if you
mean, once you have the ability to cut the DNA wherever you want and attach something that you desire to have, that like makes me ask a question like, are we becoming powerful than God, or
yeah, I think
where I think there would be a lot of ethical issues as well,
yeah,
right? In when you talk about uh, Casper and genetic modifications.
yeah, definitely. So that is one aspect that is actually slowing down these kind of researches, because it is
Yeah.
highly regulated, and like you'll have to get a lot of sanctions to even conduct these sort of make trials and see if these will actually work. And also they say it is accurate, but it is all relatively, because yeah, now this opens up a lot of like opportunities for us. For example, in one of the websites, in one of the uh, pharmaceutical companies called Verve Therapeutics, I think the chief executive officer, he was talking about one idea that he had. He was like, why not we turn off the gene in the liver that is responsible to lower like blood cholesterol levels, right? That is only one example. Then people are also doing research in using this to treat HIV and then HARPs. Um, but the biggest problem here is, are these like ethically uh, welcomed, or
Yeah.
permission?
Also, I think one is the ethical part of it, and then the other thing is, for example, when you talk about, you just mentioned about removing that particular gene in the liver or something, right? So, in case in future, if we plan to do something like that, there are a lot of complications that one has to think about, right? We just see the positive side of manipulating something, but there might be a lot of backlash further down the lane, right? Maybe we might end up resolving the short-term issue, but there might be a lot of long-term issues that end up cropping up, right?
Yeah,
It's
actually,
like
not even long term. Even these, like uh, I I went through some of the clinical trials. Uh, some of the cuts are not very precise. Something called off-target cleavage happens, where it doesn't cut the portion that's intended to, and that has some very big implications. It doesn't give you the required result. Or for example, I was looking at using CRISPR to develop a medication for cancer. In that case, and this was related to red blood cells, and the patient was not having enough red blood cells being produced, and I think they had a tumor in their bone marrow from where new red blood cells are made. They almost saw zero like improvement in using this technique because of the off-target cleavage.
Yeah.
So the
Also, the thing
success rate
is,
is also still low, like around 60-70%. Uh,
mhm.
but if they make a more repeatable process, this will be sort of the next breakthrough.
Also, I think one more complication to something like this is how would different people react to these sort of things, right?
Right.
That's a whole new can of worms that needs to be resolved, because
Yeah,
not everyone
definitely.
would respond to such a treatment in the same way, right?
Right.
And you would have also societal issues develop, right? So these, I'm sure, like these kind of procedures are going to cost a lot more. And so if you are able to create like more intelligent people by, say gene editing or something like that, it will largely be accessible to the section of society which is more affluent, rather than other section. And so, it kind of creates a societal imbalance. Yeah, we
Right.
all see it with the COVID vaccine, right? It was like the developed countries were the first ones who got the vaccine, but it was later distributed to other countries which had less resources in those terms. So
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
global
definitely.
will surely play a role.
Yep. So how I see it is, if you want attributes that are nice to have, or that you I would term as luxury, or things that are not essential for you to survive or fight a disease, that people will obviously take it to the stage to debate and question it ethically. But many of the applications that I've gone through are more of like life-saving applications for now. For
Yep.
example, there's a disease called sickle cell disease. Sickle cell, if you just Google it, it's basically like it's again a disease related to like red blood cell, in which the red blood cell doesn't carry enough oxygen, and in this the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic engineering process has been a lifesaver, and this is actually one of the very few genetically engineered medicines that is FDA approved actually, like because this is the only like option to sort of save the patient. Basically how it works is, I think it suppresses like a gene, like the hemoglobin gene, which is like normally turned off in normal human beings, which helps us carry enough oxygen. So what they do is they genetically modify that gene to like suppress it as it should be. So that like sort of cures this disease. So as you can see, like in places where it works, it is very promising. So people are very tempted to use this technique to cure cancer, to cure autism, Alzheimer disease. In terms of autism, we've not even fully understood the disease itself. Many scientists believe that autism is caused due to more than 100 different gene modifications. So here we are talking about only couple of like a handful of modifications we want to make. So in the sickle cell disease, it's the example of just the hemoglobin cell, right? In terms of autism, it seems like they'll have to make modifications to more than like 100 segments of genes. So you can imagine if one of them happens to be modified off target, then it basically messes up the entire process, right? It basically renders it futile. So that's it, all of these in terms of these big diseases that has been plaguing mankind for long, like cancer, autism. We are still sort of in like clinical stages and doing our research to see how we can use genetic engineering to combat that. I think before we sort of move on, I can probably give one more. We've only talked about like human sort of genetic modifications. One interesting uh, one interesting research I came across was modifying the genes in mosquitoes to combat malaria. So it seemed few guys would know malaria. The only a specific type, a species of mosquitoes carry malaria. So they are trying to use the same gene editing technique to suppress a specific gene in that mosquito. So it sort of becomes no longer a parasite for malaria. And this sort of technique is called gene drive. So when you take a specific gene in a population and you don't want it, you modify a group of mosquitoes, and in the gene in a group of mosquitoes, introduce them in the ecosystem. And then eventually what happens down the line is as they reproduce and have offsprings, they'll almost have no trait of the original gene that is able to take up malaria as a parasite. It's called gene drive. This is also highly controversial, and the problem with this is it is after a point it is sort of uncontrollable, right? You can see like you do a modification, introduce it, and then after that what happens is not your uh, in your hands. So what I think what they've done now is they've done it in a very contained environment. Like they'll have thousands of mosquitoes in a lab. They've done it in Imperial College in London, I think, and also in Africa, to sort of test this and see how this concept works. It was pretty promising, but they're still sort of debating if they should um, do this and make sure like they fully understand the implications on the ecosystem, because they're literally sort of modifying one species of mosquito, so they don't know how will it cause any sort of ecosystem imbalance or anything like that. So they're trying to like simulate or understand and account for all sorts of unforeseen side effects of doing this before they actually do.
Yeah, when you talk about side effects of modifying the biology, or for that point, say modifying the ecology, one of the example that comes to my mind is the example of cane toads. So these were animals that were artificially introduced into Australia to control destructive beetles. So they thought we'll introduce these toads so that they can reduce the number of beetles that are affecting their crop. And then there weren't any animals that were consuming toads, so their population automatically increased.
Right.
And Australia ended up having this issue of cane toads all over the place. So I think this something like this is very pretty much possible when you try to mess with the
like
ecology,
ecosystem balance. I think it's like a ripple effect. Like you try to make a modification, the nature will respond with its own, right? It'll mutate and say, okay, you've done this to me, now I'll do this to adapt myself to this.
Yep. It's a highly non-linear sort of problem where
right.
a butterfly somewhere will create a big mess somewhere else, right? One thing leading to the other.
There is, up to some extent, we can predict what the nature's response is going to be, right? Because we know how the natural selection is going to be.
Yeah, I was thinking of it as a good business model, right? If you give all these scientists who are asking these profound questions, if they have a model in their disposition, right, to basically start with an initial condition and then trigger this one mutation or imbalance and model, okay, what's going to happen in a larger scale, then that might give more.
So I think it's a very challenging problem, Hari, because if you look at it, an analogy to it is predicting the weather, right? So if you look at it, look at a weather app typically in the US, the weather that is being predicted 5 days later, if you check it after 3 days, it completely changes. So with all the advancements that we have, we are not able to predict weather accurately.
I mean, there is certain
how evolution would affect our planet. I think the level of non-linearity is like multifold when you talk
Yeah.
about problems like this. But I think it's an interesting research, and I'm sure that people are working on it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It's like Navier-Stokes equation, right? For it makes sense for engineer. Like we make so many assumptions so we can solve it, but in its purest form with like zero assumptions, I think it's like you cannot
Yeah.
solve it using
The current computing facilities
yeah.
that we have, I guess.
Even with the atmospheric situation, like, so you have to measure like how individual air particles behave, and that will contribute to how the weather will behave on a much macro scale. So as Loka mentioned, like butterfly effect, even a
Yeah.
small change in the initial condition is likely to over a period of time amplify the variations and give a completely different result.
Yeah. I was thinking of it like, instead of doing all the computation in one, place or in one system, we sort of all contribute to the bigger simulation. So no one knows the result of the biggest simulation, but I will compute just what will happen to a specific, species of animal. You will do it for a specific plant. So we get a group of like, thousands of simulators, right? Uh, each giving its own like result, and then we get an overall simulation. But that's just an idea. But that is the biggest roadblock is, people you don't understand fully what implication it will have on the ecosystem.
Yep.
So I think this is a good point to now sort of switch our discussion to stem cells. The stem cells and genetic engineering are sort of very, I would say, closely connected. And you sort of understand why. To just give like a very brief background, stem cells um, are basically like essential for every like human being or like even organisms. They are found in like animals. I think they're, if you think about it, we all have evolved from a single cell, right? So if you question, okay, how did I become such a specialized, like sophisticated organism all from one single cell? The answer is stem cells. Like stem cells are like one of the more like first cells to be created after the fusion of the sperm and the egg, like the first copies, and they're immensely powerful in terms of like replicating and specializing into other cells. So they are basically like the building blocks of a single celled organism that bring us to who we are now. And once we have evolved, right, becoming and are growing, it helps us maintain what we are also. So without stem cells, I think I read it somewhere, without stem cells, we are said to probably survive 1 hour max. And like after that, your body won't, like there's nothing to sustain your body. So like every day you're like losing million cells out of your body, like your skin is giving off like 40,000 cells every hour. So what is balancing this, so what is creating new cells is basically stem cells that are embedded deep inside your skin layer. So it's basically balancing and doing all the repairing and maintenance in your body to sustain life. So
I see.
when basically like when stem cells develop like from single cell, those are called embryonic stem cells. And as I said, those are the most potent, I would say. Because they are not specialized at all, and they can make multiple copies of their own. They'll, and then what happens is through the development process, as we grow older, they all evolve into adult cells. Adult cells are also stem cells, but they are more specialized. So what happens is these embryonic cells, they slowly become skin cells, or they slowly become red like blood cells, or bone marrow cells, or they become mesenchymal cells, which is basically like a technical term for organ specific cells. So liver cells, heart cells, lung cells, uh, those are also stem cells, but they cannot become other cells. Like a heart cell cannot become like lung cell, or they only embryonic cells can like evolve to become these adult cells. So this is all basically basics of stem cells. So their whole idea is, if the heart cell for some reason a set of cells are getting damaged, they'll replace. They'll basically make new copies of themselves, and they'll keep the system balanced. But the biggest breakthrough in stem cells was made in 2006. I think there was a Japanese scientist. I don't recollect his name, but he was actually awarded a Nobel Prize for this. Is that he discovered that by genetically modifying, or by introducing certain like chemicals and genetically modifying these specialized cells, the adult cells, right? You can get them back to being an embryonic cell, meaning they are not specialized. They can again be used for anything. So the range of this impact was that, um, let's say you have a heart disease, right? And you want that to be fixed. What they'll do is they'll take cells, specialized cell from your femur, which is like your thigh bone, or like a bone marrow, which is specialized in red cells. They'll modify it to become what is called induced pluripotent cells. That's what it's called, IPSC, or IP stem cells. That's what he was awarded a Nobel Prize for. They'll take that, they'll convert them into non-specialized cells, and then they'll insert them in your heart. So it'll sort of do, or like heal the heart on its own, and do its job as stem cells. So that was a game changer in terms of stem cells. And that's
Yeah.
what he
So
was.
when you mention
About.
about this, it asks me it forces me to ask this question, does all this research end up leading us to achieving immortality, or we are finding different
Yeah,
ways of fixing the issues that our body has, right?
I think
So do you?
you asked a very interesting question, because I looked into that too. It turns out that lobsters do not age; they just like die. So they're actually doing research in seeing if we can use some genes from lobsters to
I mean,
fight aging and for
the
anti-aging.
the situation of a person developing a cancer is reverse aging, right? Because you're creating new cells, but uh, you create it at such a rapid pace that it will create some kind of uh, mold, and that will give rise to
Mhm.
cancer. But yeah, if you look at aging process, it's like the cells are dying. So
Yep.
uh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. True. That's like I'm telling you, these stem cells, genetic engineering, like everyone is in the race. Like everyone in the pharmaceutical industry, therapeutic like labs are all sort of racing to find that one repeatable cure for like cancer, uh, for autism and all that. We already have established and like FDA approved, I think, approved treatments for leukemia, which is like, so blood transfusion. So like now you don't have to go out and like get a blood that exactly matches like
Oh,
your like uh, I don't know, blood group or anything like that, because they've found out a way to sort of use these. I think it's called hematophoe, which is basically like the technical term for blood. So they've successfully been able to use stem cells from the bone marrow. So by the way, stem cells are found like everywhere in your body. So they
Mhm.
were able to use them from the bone marrow, where these red cells are produced, to sort of treat um, a lot of blood related diseases. And the same goes for leukemia, like skin disorders. They've been able to use epidermal skin stem cells to cure leukemia also. Um, so basically, those embryonic cells are not very interesting, because it's a very transition phase. You won't find them. Specialized cells are also not that interesting. The IP cells that I mentioned, the induced pluripotent cells, those were game changers, and they've been used like sort of in all kinds of treatment. Uh, there were few testimonies also. I saw a TED talk by like by a doctor from TEDx Ashland, and he was talking about uh, the strength of using stem cell therapy. He had a patient who had a hip accident, I think, and he had to get a total hip replacement on his right. And the problem with that is, since it's done mechanically and you'll have to introduce foreign particles, the recovery period is very strenuous. If it's not done properly, you will not be comfortable like for your lifetime. Nothing can be done because your bone basically grows over like whatever implant you have, like titanium or anything like that. And there's always a possibility of whether your body will accept that foreign particle. So what he was able to do is, instead of without having any operation, this patient also needed a hip replacement on the other side. Uh, so he basically took some of the stem cells and just he basically injected like 8 million of these mesenchymal cells, which are like specialized cells from the patient itself, and inject them on the other side of his hip. And he didn't see any improvement in like few months, but after 6 months the patient had virtually no pain, and he could like barely see any difference between like left and right. So
Okay.
it was proved as a way more effective way of uh, treating hip related accidents or fractures or uh, injuries when it comes to hip replacement. There's also another testimony he gave that was related to uh, diabetic foot. If you just Google that, so diabetic foot is basically like a very reduced blood circulation to your feet. There's hardly none. And what happens is like, so you can imagine, if there's no blood flow, if there's any injury or cut, it will never get repaired, or it will never close itself. So you'll see like large holes in the feet of the patient. Basically, your body is not working to fix it. So this same doctor was able to again inject like red blood, like stem cells in the feet area, I guess. And basically, the stem cells were able to restore the blood circulation in the feet and completely cover the wound and treat the diabetic foot.
Yeah, I mean, diabetic foot is something which is quite common, right?
Yeah.
As we grow old, and I think something like this would be really helpful to resolve that issue, or else it might like lead to extreme cases where you might have to amputate the foot.
Exactly. Yep.
So I mean, all these things that we discussed brings us to a question that how are we different from rest of the animals on this planet that we know as Earth, right? There are so many animals, and it's only we, the humans, who are trying to constantly make sense of what is going around us, be it the advancements in physics, chemistry, biology, or for that matter, space that we discussed in our first episode. We have been constantly trying to discover new things and answer the questions that are constantly bugging us, right? So something that differentiates us from the rest of the animals is the intelligence that we have. If one has to ask a question, why we, at this point, even I don't think any of us or the smartest man on earth would be able to answer that particular question. But that being said, I thought it would be nice, since the topic is biology, we could talk a bit about how our brain functions and a bit about the nervous system, right? So as we would have learned in our high school biology, the nervous system is broken down into two major parts: the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is essentially the branches that are coming out of your spinal cord. These are like two-way highways one sending signals from your sensory organs to your brain. And once the brain gives us the message of what needs to be done, that particular message is again delivered to your muscles, which create the motions in your body. So this is the PNS, and the CNS, which is the central nervous system, is the brain and the spinal cord. So the nervous system is composed of billions of nerve cells, which we known as neurons. If you remember in high school, we had a question where we had to draw the neuron, right?
Yeah.
You remember that?
Then label it
So,
the parts of the neuron.
Dendrite.
so we had three main parts: dendrites, which are essentially the inputs to the neuron. We have a centrally located nucleus, which consists of the cell. And then we had a long tail-like structure known as the axon. So the axon is essentially the output that the neuron gives. And it turns out that all the neurons in our body need not look the same. They vary in their functionality. They also vary in the size and shape, which is pretty reasonable. The size, for example, might vary from few inches to up to 1 meter long. The 1 meter long neuron is essentially that long because the nucleus is still small, it's in millimeters, but the axon, which is the output part, is the longer portion of that particular neuron. This particular neuron is attached from the bottom of our spine to our toes. So this is the longest neuron in our body. So that being said, what I was looking up was what are the current advancements in neuroscience, especially what researchers are looking into is they're trying to understand the functioning of our brain and the nervous system in a better way, and trying to model this particular mechanism. Because if you look at things these days, most of the drive is towards creating artificial intelligence, right? And though the claims are pretty huge, we have to respect the reality that we are nowhere close to how a human brain functions, right? So the state of the art research right now is mainly concentrated on better understanding how the brain functions. And
I think
one of the interesting
to add
Yes.
on to your point, like, so what currently people think is that if you increase the computational speed and the amount of computing or processing power, then you should reach to how the brain functions. But I guess that's not it. There's something much more to, what gives rise to consciousness, or
that yes, that's a very good and valid point. In fact, based on what I was looking up, um, till now, in the past century, there has been this idea that the way a computer functions, you have a couple of transistors which are working in synergy to create what we see as a computer system, right? And that's how people have envisioned even the brain to work as. But recent research shows that it's the way brain functions is much more complex. It's not just simple in and out transistors that are working in synergy. So to give a context to this particular fact that I just shared, till now, neuroscientists were envisioning neurons as a single cell, a single dumb structure, which takes a set of inputs. Uh, it has a logic gate. It can be AND gate, it can be OR gate, it can be NOR gate, it can be XOR gate, like all the typical gates that we look in computer science. A neuron can have a specific sort of gate, and it gives an output based on all the inputs that it gets. It transmits an output through its axon. So this was the understanding till now. But recently, researchers have uh, come to a point where they are detecting that the dendrites on each of the each neuron has multiple dendrites, which are essentially the inputs. So each of these dendrites are acting as independent computing systems. So an input that is coming to a certain dendrite is being modified and then being sent to the cell of that particular neuron. So what implications does this breakthrough have? It essentially tells us that this is not a neuron is not a simple uh, a logic gate. It has multiple stacked layers of, say, if I have to give an analogy in neural networks, a simple neuron is more than a double layered neural network. It's, if you have to think of it, it's a deep neural network, in fact. So now the question that researchers are asking is that, okay, if a single neuron can do a function of a computing function, for example, then why does the human neuron, or any neuron for that matter, have these dendrites acting as independent computing structures? So one of the speculations is that if we can answer this particular question, why this is the structure in which the nervous system is functioning, then we'll be able to develop better deep neural networks to conduct research in AI for vision and AI for hearing. So we can like come closer to mimic how a human body really functions.
So Lokaditya, I have one question for you. So when you say like it's a logic gate, and you mentioned that these dendrites are operating independently, right? My question is like, so a logic gate is essentially a discrete valued output. So is this how even a switching mechanism, say, in the brain works, or is it more of a continuous variable output?
So based on what I have read, this is essentially like in computers, you have zeros and ones, right? Where you have on and off switches. The way a nervous system works is when it's on, it essentially releases a chemical that creates a low energy electrical pulse going through your axon. And in case your inputs are configured in such a way that it has to behave like an off switch, it would essentially not transmit any signal to the next coming neurons. So it's essentially a 0 and 1 function, but uh, given the complexity now that we have learned that each of the dendroid that is connected to the neuron can act as an independent computing system, it essentially complicates things, right? So maybe that might be a reasoning why humans are very quick at responding to things and identifying things, right? Compared to a simple AI that we are trying to identify objects using computer vision or something.
True. Actually, I was till now, I mean, before this discussion, my understanding of the neurons was like more like a perception system, right? Like the sole purpose is just get the signals from outside, like cameras in a car, but don't do the computation. Just transmit the signals, and then there's another central system, maybe like your spine, like your central nervous system, as you said, CNS. I thought that is where the decision is taken, a processing of that message is done.
Yes,
But
yes. So the decision is still taken in the brain. The only thing is there is an additional layer of gates that are happening. So essentially, if you get, so if I have to talk in terms of engineering terms, say you have 10 dendrites to a single neuron. Okay, so that means you have 10 inputs. Previously, the idea was these 10 inputs go into the cell of the neuron. You have some sort of logic gate, and that gives you an output. That gate could be AND gate, it can be OR gate or anything. But now it's turning out that the input dendrites themselves are acting as some sort of gates. So it's manipulating the input signal at the dendrite level, sending that as an output to the cell, and that again acts as a gate, and then you get a output.
okay,
So it's
an
like
added
an
layer.
additional layer. Yep.
Got it. Yep.
So this particular convolution of the layers in which the nervous system is operating can potentially advance our research in artificial intelligence and neural networks, like the better we understand how this nervous system works, we can maybe use that particular knowledge and implement in artificial intelligence. So that's where the current research is headed.
Very interesting. I think I just had a follow-up question on that. But basically, it's like, so if I have, let's say in my fingertip, I have a neuron, you have a neuron, and there are some dendrites there. So the output of the dendrites in my neuron don't have to necessarily match yours, your dendrite output, right? Which means what you perceive and what I perceive necessarily don't have to be the same then, because the individual dendrites are taking their own decision, right?
So that comes down to like the question that I come
Yeah.
across like frequently, like how do you know that the blue color that I see
It's
is
blue.
the same as the blue color that you see?
I now have a strong feeling it is not, because it's subjective, I feel. It's just that we agree, or we all agree to be. So let's say imaginatively I am seeing green, but it just happens that whenever you see blue, I'm seeing green. So we both have sort of agreed it is blue, but I am looking at green, which is right.
So this actually brings like to my next sort of idea that I wanted to discuss with you guys. So when we talk about this nervous system, it's an analogous to neural networks, right? Where you train the neural network and build a black box and then expose it to new data, and we expect it to work fine, right? So that's the idea. So when I was going through all these topics, it brought me to this wondering or questioning that are we a neural network indeed? I mean, if you look at it, you are born with all these neurons, right? But as a newborn baby, you don't know anything. Like there are few involuntary things that you would do. Obviously, if you touch a hot surface, you will like return back. These are something that are involuntary. But the learnings that we get, isn't it analogous to training a neural network? Like if you look at it as a kid, our parents or someone would tell us this is correct, this is wrong, this is blue, 1 + 1 is 2. So this is similar to supervised learning, right? And as we grow up, that learning slowly transforms into unsupervised learning or reinforced learning. Some sort of analogy is what I was trying to get to. Like,
yeah, I see.
Aren't we a well-trained neural network? Well-trained deep neural network, I guess humans are.
Yeah,
I guess this is more like an overlap towards biomimicry, where you observe what's happening in nature and you develop a computation.
Yeah, so we understood how neurons work, and basically each segment in a neural network is like a neuron making its own dendrite, I would say now.
Yeah. So basically, that being said, I would also like to bring us to a fact that we are trying to go back, but the way how neural networks started, the whole research on artificial intelligence started was getting inspired from the nervous system. So at this point, when I asked, are we similar to a neural network? It really
is like being inspired on the other way.
Yeah, it's like the cycle repeating itself.
It's like the chicken and egg problem, right?
Yep.
What came first?
I think except for the fact that we can forget information or we can forget what we learned, which I guess you can sort of artificially induce in neural networks that we build in like artificial intelligence. But I think when we build neural networks or deep learning algorithm, we don't necessarily make it forget, or it doesn't forget what it learned, right? But we as human beings can forget, like our brain can, selectively erase memory of what it's not.
Again, I think like we are just scratching on the aspect of like intelligence, and we are not looking at the prospect of like self-awareness or like consciousness and these things. So
Mhm.
yeah. So
one of the explanation that researchers are giving that what is this? Isn't it redundant that each of the dendrite themselves has
Right.
this computation power when the neuron can do that? So one of the possible explanation that researchers are giving is that uh, if individual dendrites can act as gates, then maybe few of the neurons can avoid working, and that way the brain can save some energy, right?
I see.
So
Yeah.
it's sort of maybe it's trying to optimize
Energy saving.
the energy consumption, but this is just a speculation, right? At this point, I
Right.
think this sort of research is pretty up to date, and I think there are still questions that need to be answered, right?
right. I mean, so if I kind of, I can probably, connect what you have been talking about, and what the engineering community has been able to contribute to in this domain. So one of the recent advancements that we see is in the field of brain-computer interface. So there are a lot of people who have disability issues, who are born with like no legs or no limbs, and they have difficulty doing everyday routine, and so prosthetics has been a field where you are able to 3D print, say, a bionic arm, and strap it onto a person and help them achieve various tasks. But if they are able to use this brain to communicate directly to the prosthetic arm, then they can probably control this prosthetic arm by thinking about the action that they want to do. And
Mhm.
so there was recently a research that was done, not recently, it's like 10 years back. It was carried out by OSU, Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, where they came across a patient who had a severe spine injury, and like the person could not communicate with the arm, uh, and so they used something called as an electroencephalogram, which is also called as EEG, which essentially picks up the brain signals and it provides command to your arm. So they strapped a bunch of electrodes on the forearm, and they used the signals that is created by the brain. So when the person says, okay, I want to say go and grasp this thing, it produces certain, the brain thinks about it,
Signals.
which is these signals are captured, and then it is again like uh, transferred to the electrodes, and these electrodes will in turn will stimulate the muscles to go and pick up a pen or something like that. And so that was one such procedure that was done. And then there was a more invasive kind of a experiment which they did, where they implanted computer chips surgically into the person's brain, and so it directly takes those signals from specific neurons. And yeah, that was also like they were able to handle, the patient was able to handle like certain objects by this procedure. But the issue came about when like it's just one way where the brain is able to communicate with the hand, but the person is not able to sense the object that he or she is trying to pick up. And so what they uh, what they did was like so they discovered that although the spinal cord was injured, there were few uh, uh, nerves which were still active, and which still communicated the information from the hand to the brain, but the person was not able to sense it. So what they used was they cleverly used just these signals from these specific nerve cells, and they used a vibrotactile device, which is essentially like a strap-on, like vibrating device. So anytime the person touches, he or
It'll
the
vibrate.
patient would feel the vibration in the
Got it.
bicep. So Yeah, so this it takes a little bit of getting used to,
Getting
but the person was, kind of was able to navigate and use this kind of tools to uh, go about their normal life.
very interesting. See, this
Yep.
this kind of
And
inventions like make you think that okay, we have some decent understanding of how the brain works, at least in the peripheral level,
Right.
yeah,
right?
But still there is
I
If
this
mean,
it's
kind of
actually working.
issue with, like which part of the brain
Uh,
corresponds to which kind of an action, because they are not able to see like clear partitions in the brain saying, okay, this is the part which contributes to this kind of an action. And
right.
it always changes. And so over here for this patient, they try to take signals from the part of the brain called motor cortex, which is responsible for generating voluntary movements. But then they
Uh,
realize like there is sometimes there is an overlap, like there is the part of the brain which creates these voluntary movements, it overlaps with other parts of the brain as well.
yes. I was gonna because Loka you shared an article from Quanta magazine, and that article basically tells us to take a step back and not assume, have any preconceived notion that a specific part of the brain should be associated with a specific function, because they did some experiments where like just during respiration, one third of the brain was like lit up with activity, or with like eye movement, there was like half of the brain was lit up. So they couldn't. The neuroscientists are being advised to, better understand the brain. We should not sort of map the real estate of the brain into specific functions. They're like keep it open and then try to analyze it from the brain as a whole instead of just the hypothalamus or just a specific part
Cerebrum.
of it.
yeah. I mean, it makes more sense, right? Given the complexity of tasks that a human can do, and brain is the central organ that is helping it. I don't think it would be an efficient way the God would have designed, like the
Mhm.
brain, that it's
Yeah,
doing certain tasks in certain portions, because it's not like all the tasks need to be done at the same time. So I'm
yeah,
guessing that would be the right way, because based on the requirement, any random portion should be able to complete the same task, right?
hmm,
But it's still like very intriguing, like to think about it, like
yeah,
how complex these things are. And uh, does
yeah.
quantum physics have any role to play in how the brain functions? uh, because you are no more looking at a discrete system, it's all about, I guess,
Very
probabilities.
continuous. Yeah,
So
yeah. So the thing is here, they are not arguing that what we have found till now is wrong, because as you quoted, like we are correct. We are able to apply this knowledge of our brain that we have till now to implant chips and help people who are handicapped to sort of gain their freedom of motion again.
right.
But the thing is, they're like we have some basic understanding. For example, visual cortex is impaired, then you cannot, things with vision are impaired. But they're like don't restrict it just to visual cortex. Look at other parts that might also be playing a role in vision. Is what
Yeah.
they're trying to
So
say.
when we talk about implanting chips, right? Did we talk about Neuralink, the startup
No,
by Elon
we are
Musk?
not. Yeah,
Oh yeah, did you
Yeah.
guys happen
So
to see the monkey play ping pong game with a Neuralink chip
I
that
think I've
was,
seen that.
yeah. So it used to get a reward, which was essentially some kind of a food which was given to it through
Mm-hmm.
pipe, and it had to properly place the
Mm-hmm.
pad
Paddle.
in the correct
Yeah.
position so that the ball is able to reflect off it, and it would just think, and it was able to control.
Nice.
mhm. So Elon Musk had promised that Neuralink will start implanting chips into the brains of humans by 2022. This was a
Again,
news December 8th, 2021, but I'm not sure how
we'll
far they
see.
have come in that particular research.
So obviously, there's going to be a big ethical uproar.
Yep.
People are having conspiracies on vaccines containing chips. No, now if you explicitly say you're going to implant a chip, well, you should be ready for some heavy confrontation.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, all the
When
data.
we talk, when we talk about invasive sort of remedies, right, this is always going to be an issue. It might help us in few things, but it might also what you call lead us to like more complications where your privacy is being breached into, and then
I mean,
I don't think it
not
will be
necessarily be just invasive. I mean, even non-invasive technologies you see, like Google, or they are constantly tracking your location. But that's a separate topic. Let's get back to biology.
I mean, as long as we as humans see use in it, then
exactly.
I don't
I was
think
gonna come to that.
after a point we'll start living with it, I guess.
Yeah. It's like there's a patient who's done stage 1 like chemotherapy, who's done tried everything and is still not seeing improvement. Now those are the people like who will be definitely willing to accept any kind of invasive method, right? Because it's a point of survival. It's a question of survival, whether it will be a viable solution. But if Elon Musk, right, if you just want to do it, I don't know, without solving a big pressing problem, then people will complain about it.
As long as people have a choice to have it implanted and then removed,
Choice.
I guess it's good. So recently he said like they plan to use the chip, the Neuralink, to restore full body functionality for someone with spinal cord injury. So I think it lines up what I just told about the research at OSU Exner Medical Center.
Now I can see many patients being willing to get that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when we talk about all these applications of biology, one important thing for us as mechanical engineers is mimicking the biological species and using it in various designs, right? Which is the topic of biomimicry. So I think we shouldn't discard that particular topic because that is of huge relevance to us.
Yes, Loka, that's something that is that has been around for a long time, and I guess it will continue to have a significant impact on the way we design things and the way we build our society. So biomimicry is kind of like a design which is inspired by the nature. So as you guys know, like nature is a storehouse for knowledge and inspiration through the process of evolution. Like over billions of years, nature has trial and tested different ways in which it can come about with a good design. So for instance, if you look at, say, a bird, it's able to fly because its wing has this airfoil shape. And like today we are able to use the same design for our airplanes. And similarly, if you look at like aquatic mammals, like aquatic animals like manta ray, which are able to, although they weigh so much, the drag coefficient that they experience is far lower. And like if we are able to design our propellers in such a way that they are able to reduce the drag coefficient, I guess that will we can essentially replicate the same design and improve the efficiency and reduce the inefficiencies. So biomimetics or biomimicry is the emulation of model of nature for the purpose of solving complex human problems. And this reminds me of a quote by Albert Einstein, who said, "Look deep into nature and you will understand everything." So in biomimetics, we kind of try to replicate the form, shape, and the process that is being performed. So one example over here that I would like to mention is that I read through was the spider web. So you would have come across like the spider web design. Spider web is mostly water and protein, but it is nearly 5 times stronger than steel. So this is and it's able to build this kind of like web structures, two-dimensional structures, which has like higher strength, toughness, elasticity. And even if there is like a local impact due to some kind of a debris, the entire architecture of the web is not disintegrated. It's only localized to one particular region. So spiders have found a way to optimize and adapt their web structure by providing like protection and housing, and they are very efficient tools for like catching prey. So how can we use this kind of a design tool? Like where can we use it? So if you think about like construction of buildings for earthquake, in earthquake zone, if we are able to like localize the damage to one particular region by designing certain truss structures which can balance out the loads, then I think, yeah, this can be used. And also like when when a virus affects a computer network, probably you can try to switch off one particular server which controls that cluster of computers which is affected by the virus, and in that way you can localize this kind of an issue. um, so similarly, if you look at like the cactus, right? So in desert, cactus does not get like sufficient water, but it has developed this thing like the thorns on the cactus. It is able to collect the fog, and since it has a conical shape, it has like the pressure gradient is increases as it moves from the tip to the root. So it is able to collect the fog water and like push it towards the root of the tip, and it's able to absorb that water. So like this kind of mechanism can be used to design buildings in like desert region where they have like very less water. uh, Another example of like biomimicry is in lotus leaf. So lotus leaf has this ability to repel any kind of water that falls on it. And so you may be wondering like, why does it only repel? It is a self-cleaning technique that it uses. So any kind of water or chemical droplet that falls on it, it as the water moves away from the leaf, it also collect the dirt particles that is accumulated on the leaf. So yeah, you can make use of this kind of, people have been able to make use of this kind of technology to uh, uh, separate out oil and water. So probably during an oil spill up, you can clean the ocean by creating this kind of coatings on surfaces, and yeah, using this technology.
Yeah, I think recently on social media we are seeing these sort of technologies where you put a sort of spray on your shoe and the shoe becomes repellent to everything, right? Have you seen that?
Right.
I think maybe
And
something, it
right.
might
And
be inspired from what you're just mentioning. Also, I think it might find application on spraying a coating on the car, so that you need not go for a car wash every 2 or 3 months, right?
right.
I think they
It's
already
interesting.
do the coating when you go for a car wash, especially your tires. If you go for a car wash, you see they are
Uh-huh.
extra shiny
Yep.
and repel water at least
Another,
for some time.
Right.
yes.
And also
Another
like this.
biomimicry thing that I remember is like uh, uh, Dr. Carlos Castros from Ohio State University. Their lab researches into how ant neck can sustain weights up to 100 and
Yeah.
1,000 times its own weight. So they are looking into how the neck is actually structured, and based on what I have read, it's sort of based on the joints in these small creatures are completely different from that of a vertebrate. Vertebrates tend to have like rigid bones and joints, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these non-vertebrates, insects or ants for that matter, have porous joints, right? So it gives them that special ability where they can handle weights which are way above their own weight. So understanding such systems might in future help us in designing better materials, I think, smart materials.
Right. I mean, adding to the examples that you gave, you can probably design self-cleaning windows for buildings,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
using this technology, like
I
where
think you mentioned that. I'm reminded of reading about camels in deserts, and they get so many like sand, like storm or like dust in their eyes. I think their eyelids or eyes are designed to sort of self clean or keep the dust out.
the dust out. Yeah.
Nice.
Some more examples of like biomimetic devices, like so this was from a TED talk by Professor Bharat Bhushan from Ohio State University. So where he spoke of, like you can make like painless needles. So although mosquitoes come and bite, sit on your skin and like they suck the blood, it'll take like about 5 minutes for you to realize that they are doing that. So if we can use this way to like create painless needles. uh,
Yeah, I mean, you say painless needles. I think comparing my childhood and now, I feel like needles have come a far way. Like I remember when I was young, if you get like those boosters, like I'm not talking about the COVID boosters, but the ones you get for like I don't know, varicella and polio and all those. Not polios are drops, but other diseases. Uh, I remember I couldn't walk for like 2 days, and like my dad would usually have to like carry me on his back or something. But nowadays, like even booster shots or like the injections, which have to inject a large volume of the solution in your body, even those have become very less painful, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
right.
So, if I understand it right, I think the ones with the injections which are directly given to the muscle tend to be very painful, but there are few which are intravenal. I
Mm.
might be completely wrong on this, but this is my understanding. So, if it is directly given inside the veins, it's less painful, is what I understand. But yeah. Also, one more example that I wanted to share that I just recollected is I wouldn't call this direct biomimicry, but something that mechanical engineering is closely related to advancements in healthcare or what you call giving targeted drug delivery, right? So when we just spoke about, since we just spoke about injections, so it's not like all the drugs can be administered directly because the medicine that you're giving sometimes might be so strong that it might also affect the healthy parts of your body. So one of the advances in drug healthcare is targeted drug delivery, where these strong medicines are transported to the location where we want them to be administered and then being delivered. So one of the methods is DNA origami. So essentially what this means is we spoke about the two strands and the chemical components being linked to each other, which makes it a spiral, right? So
Right.
these individual strands can be extracted and you can essentially do origami, literal origami with them and maybe build box sort of structures inside which we can place your medicine, and then we can use this particular box to be sent to that targeted location, and there the box opens and sends in the drug. So
Mhm.
this is something which I found very fascinating, like
Right.
DNA origami and how it's been applied to targeted drug deliveries.
This actually ties to my topic on stem cells and genetic engineering too, because right now, if you have to get a medication through genetic engineering, it's a external process. Collect some cells from you, go to a lab, do the genetic modification, come back, and then inject it back, right? Sometimes you can lose like about 4 to 5 months during the process of removing it, modifying it, and putting it back. So it's very common, very similar to what the solution you were talking about, Loka, is that they are exploring ways in future where the genetic modification takes place inside the body itself, where you package all these enzymes and the RNA that you need to do all the CRISPR works, like the basically the target cutting the segment out and then attaching the required DNA segment and joining them. They're trying to do all that internally, so you don't lose that time like going to the lab, doing it outside and then coming back. But we might be a little far from there, but that's definitely something geneticists are considering, so it'll speed up the process.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, talking about on a much more macro scale, like the problem that we are facing right now with respect to global warming. So a lot of companies are coming out with carbon capture technology, right? So which captures the carbon in the atmosphere and converts it into a form of like solidified carbon, which can be later used for other processes. One of the natural carbon capture technology out there is the tree and forest. So NASA has released it did a survey of like the global atmospheric the carbon content in the atmosphere, and it found out that like during the winter months when there are not any leaves, the amount of carbon in the northern hemisphere spikes up pretty high, but then during the summer when the trees have leaves, it kind of drops again. So probably we can use that technology to reduce the carbon content. Yeah, even modern day like bullet trains and high speed trains, they have this like conical design, which is like it is super efficient. It it is faster and it produces less noise, but this was not the case before. And like these kind of trains have gotten the inspiration from the beak of the kingfisher. So yeah, the kingfisher, when it dives into the water to catch a fish, it's able to create the least splash and the quietest noise. So they have effectively used this design in the bullet trains. So yeah.
Yeah, so moving forward, I think before we end this podcast, one final topic that I wanted to discuss with you all is something very basic. Till now, we have discussed about gene therapy, we have discussed about Casper, modifying the genes, neural networks, how the nervous system works, and biomimicry, right? All these are essentially ways that we have devised to fix few issues with our own body, right? But something which is very basic but really essential for us is sleep, right? It might sound simple. As grad students, we have all every one of us has experienced sleepless nights. And nowadays it has become a fashionable statement saying that, oh, I put out a all-nighter, right? But I was reading up upon sleep, and it turns out it's really essential for any living being. And the reason for that was pretty surprising to me. I initially had a perception that, okay, sleep might be related to our nervous system and the brain. Like it's essentially a time when the brain is relaxing and it can rest for some time, right? But it turns out that that's not the reason. Sleep is something that is not neurological, it's more physiological. One of the key example here is researchers have found that hydras, which are creatures that do have nervous systems but don't have a brain per se, also tend to sleep, and they do it at a regular basis. And by sleep here, we are talking about these organisms going into a state where they don't have any physiological motions. And the explanation that researchers have come about to explain this sort of sleep state for hydras, which are having pretty rudimentary nervous systems, is that it's more to do with the body metabolism and helping with digestion of the food, right? So this was a pretty old research, but a new one in which experiments are being done with fruit flies, they have discovered that sleeplessness would trigger formation of free radicals in the intestines of these fireflies, which might end up creating further problems in the body, finally creating a state, like deteriorating the state to a level that it can lead to fatal results. So essentially, what I had a take back from all this things that I read up was sleep was not something which was very essential to the brain, but it was something physiological. But that being said, the brain also gets some sort of damage repair when we sleep. So apparently, the brain is super active while we are sleeping. So if we look at the different levels of sleep, we have the non-REM sleep and the REM sleep, which is REM stands for rapid eye movements. And we keep on fluctuating or going back and forth between REM sleep and non-REM sleep. So I think with that, we can wrap up this particular discussion. I think we had a productive discussion. We started off with talking about pandemic. We moved on to genetic engineering, then discussed a bit about stem cells, nervous system, how we can draw analogies between our nervous system and artificial intelligence that we are trying to develop. Then various prosthetics and bio-inspired designs that can be used. So with those discussions, I agree that we haven't dealt into them with great detail, but if given an opportunity, we'll definitely plan something where we delve into these individual topics in much more details and potentially have a guest speaker on who may be much more knowledgeable on these topics than we three of us here are. But with that, before we close, Suhas and Hari, do you have something to add?
I think one
Hari,
thing I
go ahead.
forgot to bring up, or rather an interesting point in genetic engineering, was that I also came across that scientists have used genetic engineering to save endangered species. There was a specific uh, species of cattle called banting in Southeast Asia. So it was going extinct, and I think they sort of, I'm not sure exactly what the process was. Was it crossbreeding or modifying specific genes so it helps it survive better? But we can probably delve into more detail when we do a specialized podcast. But I also saw opportunities where scientists were using genetic engineering to save endangered species, which was very interesting.
Yeah, that is certainly interesting. We should plan something in future where we can get someone on and they could like enlighten us, I guess. Suhas, do you have anything to add?
No, Loka.
With that, we'll call it an end for this particular discussion. We hope to come up with much more interesting topics soon. With that, it's a goodbye from all three of us. And in case you have any feedback on how we can improve our podcasts, certain topics that you might be interested in, please feel free to share your opinion in the form of comments on YouTube. We'll also be posting this on Spotify. So with that, it's a goodbye from all three of us. See you all soon.
Thank you.